I didn't mean to hum that song out loud. It was just a habit. Something my grandmother taught me when I was 7 years old. A lullaby in Italian, soft and old. The kind of melody that lives in your bones without permission. I was in the break room at Morello's, folding napkins for the dinner rush. When I started humming, that's when I heard the footsteps stop behind me. Heavy, deliberate. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle with awareness. I looked up slowly. Luca Castellano stood in the doorway, staring at me like I'd just spoken a language only he understood. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that stole my breath. "Where?" he said, his voice rough and low. "Did you learn that song?" My throat went dry. Luca Castellano wasn't supposed to be in the break room at all. He wasn't supposed to talk to staff, period. He was table 9, the corner booth by the window. The man who came to Morello's once a month and made everyone nervous just by existing in the same building. "My grandmother," I managed to say. My voice barely steady. "She taught me when I was little. It's just a lullaby. Nothing special. Why are you asking me this?" He didn't answer right away. He stepped into the break room and closed the door behind him with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than a slam. The space suddenly felt smaller. The air thicker, like all the oxygen had been sucked out through the vents. "That song," he said slowly, his accent thicker than I'd ever heard it during the brief moments I'd served him wine, "is not something you learn from anyone. It's not in books or on the internet. It's not something Americans know at all." My hands had stopped folding napkins. They were just frozen in midair, holding white linen that suddenly felt too crisp, too real, too present. My grandmother was American. She taught it to me before she died. That's all I know about it. I swear. "What was her name?" His question came fast, urgent, like he was afraid of the answer but needed it anyway. "Margaret Sullivan. She died 10 years ago. She was a nurse during World War II, stationed in Italy for a while. She never talked much about the war, but she sang me that song every night before bed when I was little. She said it helped her sleep when nothing else could." The color drained from Luca's face, so quickly I thought he might actually collapse. He reached for the wall, steadying himself, his other hand pressed against his chest like he was trying to keep his heart from escaping his rib cage. "Margaret Sullivan," he repeated, the words barely a whisper. "Margaret Sullivan from Virginia?" "Yes." "How do you know that? How could you possibly know that?" Luca didn't answer my question. Instead, he turned toward the door, opened it just enough to lean his head through and said, 2 words in a tone I'd never heard him use before. "Everyone out." Not loud, not shouting, just 2 words delivered with such absolute authority that I heard movement immediately. Footsteps in the kitchen, the clatter of pans being set down mid-prep, Marcus's voice calling something in Italian that sounded like acknowledgement rather than protest. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice small in the suddenly quiet break room. "Service starts in 20 minutes. We have reservations. Marcus is going to lose his mind if we're not ready to open." "Marcus will do what he's told." Luca pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, typed something quickly and put it away. "Everyone will do what they're told tonight. The restaurant is closed for a private event as of right now. You can't just close Morello's. You don't own this place. Mr. Carletti is going to be furious if we turn away customers on a Wednesday night. This is one of our busiest days of the week." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his dark eyes that made my stomach twist. Not anger, not cruelty, but something deeper and more complicated. Something that looked almost like pain wrapped in decades of careful control. "Sophia," he said, and hearing my name in his mouth for the first time felt strangely intimate, like he'd touched something he shouldn't have been able to reach. "I need you to understand something very clearly. When I say everyone leaves, everyone leaves. When I say the restaurant closes, it closes. Mr. Carletti will be compensated generously for tonight's lost revenue, and he will ask no questions about why." The kitchen had gone completely silent. I could hear footsteps retreating toward the back exit, the sound of the staff leaving through the service entrance without protest, without even asking what was happening. Marcus walked past the break room with his jacket already on, his face carefully neutral, not making eye contact with either of us. "How are they all just leaving? How do they know to leave without you even telling them directly?" My heart was beating too fast, my hands trembling slightly as I set down the napkin I'd been clutching like it might save me from something I didn't understand yet. "Because they know who I am, Sophia. They've always known who I am. The only person in this building who didn't know was you. He moved to the small window that looked out over the dining room. The tables were set beautifully for evening service, candles ready to be lit, wine glasses gleaming under the chandeliers. I don't understand what that means. Who are you? You come here once a month. You order the same wine. You sit in the same booth, and everyone treats you like you're someone important, but I always thought that was just because you tip well or something. A bitter smile crossed his face. I tip well, yes, but that's not why they treat me the way they do. They treat me that way because my family has owned this building for 40 years. They treat me that way because Miss Carletti pays protection money to my organization every month to ensure his restaurant operates without interference. They treat me that way because if I wanted this entire block to disappear tomorrow, it would disappear and no one would ask questions about where it went. The words landed like stones in still water, each one creating ripples that spread wider and wider until I couldn't tell where the impact ended, and the aftermath began. Protection money. My organization. This entire block could disappear. You're not a businessman. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. You're not just some wealthy customer who likes expensive wine and privacy. You're something else entirely, aren't you? Yes. One word, delivered with the weight of absolute truth. I am something else entirely. My name is Luca Castellano. My family has run organized operations in Miami for 3 generations. Most people know me as someone to avoid, unless they want problems they can't solve. But tonight, none of that matters as much as what you just told me about your grandmother. The last staff member's footsteps faded into silence. The back door closed with a distant thunk, and then there was nothing but the two of us in an empty restaurant that felt suddenly like a stage set for something I hadn't auditioned for and didn't know how to perform. I want to leave. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I want to walk out that door with everyone else. I want to go home and pretend this conversation never happened. I know. He didn't move to stop me. But before you go, I need to tell you about a tree in Naples. I need to tell you about a promise my grandfather made me keep for 16 years without ever explaining why. And I need to show you something that's going to change everything you thought you knew about your grandmother's life during the war. I should have left. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to walk out that door, get in my car, drive home, and never come back to Morello's again. But something kept me frozen in place, staring at this man who'd just admitted to running organized crime while standing in a break room that smelled like dish soap and someone's leftover marinara sauce. A tree in Naples, I heard myself say, even though I hadn't given my mouth permission to speak. What does a tree in Naples have to do with my grandmother? Luca reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, the kind that looked like it had been carried for decades, softened by time and touch. He opened it carefully and withdrew a small photograph, black and white, with creased edges that suggested it had been handled many times over many years. He held it out to me without a word. I took it with trembling fingers, bringing it closer to see the details in the dim light of the break room. A young woman in a nurse's uniform stood beneath an enormous olive tree, her dark hair pulled back, her smile radiant despite the war-torn building visible in the background. Next to her stood a young man in an Italian military uniform, dark-haired and sharp-jawed, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world worth surviving a war for. "That's my grandmother," I whispered, my thumb tracing the edge of the photograph. "That's Margaret. I've seen pictures of her from the war, but never this one. Never with anyone else in the frame. That's my grandfather, Giovanni Castellano. Naples, spring of 1944. Luca's voice had gone soft, almost reverent. He was recovering from shrapnel wounds in a field hospital outside the city. She was his nurse for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, they fell in love in a way that neither of them ever recovered from. I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. My grandmother looked so young, so alive, so full of hope despite standing in the ruins of a bombed city, and the man next to her, this Giovanni, looked at her with an expression I recognized, because I'd seen it in movies, read about it in books, but never quite believed existed in real life. "What happened to them?" I asked, even though some part of me already knew the answer. Couldn't be a happy one. If it had been happy, my grandmother wouldn't have come home alone. She wouldn't have married my grandfather 6 years later. She wouldn't have spent Sunday mornings sitting under that tree in her backyard, singing a song that made her eyes go distant and sad. The war happened. Duty happened. Geography happened. Luca took the photograph back gently, looking at it for a long moment before returning it to his wallet. She was transferred north with her unit in the summer of 1944. He begged her to stay, to hide, to desert if she had to. He said he would leave everything. His family, his country, whatever it took to be with her. But she left anyway. She left anyway. Because she was following orders. Because she believed the war would end soon. And they'd find each other again. Because she was 20 years old and terrified, and didn't know how to choose love over everything else she'd been taught to value. He paused, his jaw tight, and because my grandfather's father, my great-grandfather Mateo, told her the truth about who the Castellanos really were, my stomach dropped. He told her your family was an organized crime. He told her that if she married Giovanni, she would be marrying into a world that would consume her, that would put her in danger every day for the rest of her life, that would make her complicit in things she couldn't morally accept, and he was right. About all of it. Luca moved to lean against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. So she made a choice. She left. She went back to America when the war ended, and Giovanni stayed in Italy. Did they ever see each other again? No, never. Not once in 61 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. 61 years. My grandmother had lived 61 years after leaving the man in that photograph, and she'd never seen him again. She'd married my grandfather, raised my mother, built a whole life in Virginia, and never once returned to Italy. But they wrote to each other, Luca continued. Secret letters, sent through intermediaries, coded sometimes to avoid suspicion. For 61 years they wrote. Until my grandfather died in 2009. My mind did the math automatically. That was the same year my grandmother stopped singing that song. She was 92 years old when she just stopped one day. I asked her why, and she said the song didn't help her sleep anymore, that it just made her dream of things that could never be. Luca nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He died in March, cancer, 3 months from diagnosis to the end. I was 14 years old, and I spent every day with him in those final months. He told me things he'd never told anyone, secrets he'd kept for decades, and 2 days before he died, he grabbed my hand so hard it hurt, looked me in the eye, and gave me a mission. What mission? He gave me GPS coordinates, exact numbers, latitude and longitude, for a place on our family's land outside Naples. He said, every year, Giovanni, you go to this place. You find the tree, you stand under it, and you remember that love is the only thing that survives us. Everything else is dust. Luca's voice had gone rough. I didn't understand. I was 14 and stupid, and thought love was for weak people, but I promised him anyway, because he was dying and I would have promised him anything. And you went. It wasn't a question. 6 months after his funeral, I went. I found the olive grove exactly where he said it would be. One tree, older than the others by centuries, ancient, massive, with a trunk so gnarled it looked like it had survived every war Italy had ever fought. He looked at me directly, his dark eyes intense, and carved into that trunk so deep the bark had grown around the letters over 80 years, were 2 initials, Mem plus G, surrounded by a heart. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Margaret and Giovanni. I've gone back every year since. For 16 years, I've stood under that tree on the anniversary of his death, and I've tried to understand what kind of love makes a man protect a carving for his entire life. What kind of love makes him give his dying wish to a grandson, to guard something that had been dead for decades. He pushed off from the counter, but I never knew who Muyo was. I never knew the story, until tonight. Until I heard you humming a song that only my grandfather and your grandmother knew. The break room felt too small. Suddenly, the air too thick with the weight of 80 years of longing and loss and love that had survived everything except time and distance. My grandmother had kept this secret her entire life. She'd sung me a song every night, and I'd never known it was a love letter to a man she'd left behind in a bombed-out city in 1944. There's more, Luca said quietly. Before he died, my grandfather told me that if anyone ever came to me knowing that song, knowing that tree, I was to protect them, that I was to give them something he'd kept hidden his entire life, something he couldn't give to Margaret while they were both alive, but wanted her to have if she ever needed it. What did he want her to have? The truth. Letters. Proof that he kept his promise to love her until the day he died. He pulled his phone from his pocket, and now that truth belongs to you. Luca's phone buzzed in his hand before I could ask what truth he was talking about. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting into something harder, more controlled, the softness that had crept into his voice when talking about his grandfather disappearing like it had never existed at all. I need to handle something, he said, typing a response quickly. But before I do, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer it. My heart was still racing from everything he'd just told me. The photograph, the tree, the letters, 61 years of secret longing between two people who'd loved each other across an ocean and never stopped. I wasn't sure I could handle another revelation, another piece of this impossible story that somehow involved me. What question? Do you want to see it? The tree in Naples, the place where they stood, the grove where my grandfather carved their initials and made a promise he kept until his last breath. He put his phone back in his pocket. I'm flying to Italy tomorrow night. Business that can't be delayed, but I could arrange for you to come with me. You could stand where your grandmother stood. You could see what I've been protecting for 16 years without understanding why. Tomorrow night. My mind stuttered over the impossibility of what he was suggesting. I can't just fly to Italy tomorrow night. I have work. I have my mother to take care of. I have responsibilities that don't just disappear because you show me a photograph and tell me a story about trees and dead people who loved each other 80 years ago. Your mother. His tone shifted slightly. Catherine. Yes? At Clearview Assisted Living, dementia progressive, requiring 24-hour care at $3,200 per month. The air left my lungs. How do you know that? How could you possibly know that? I know everything about everyone who works in establishments I protect. Sophia, it's not personal. It's practical. I need to know who might be vulnerable to pressure from rivals, who might be compromised, who might need help. They're too proud to ask for. He held up a hand when I opened my mouth to respond. Your mother is well cared for. The facility is good. The staff is competent. But you work 60-hour weeks to afford it, and you still can't cover everything. Last month you were 3 days late with payment. The month before that you had to choose between her medication and your rent. Shame burned hot in my chest. That's none of your business. You're right. It's not. But I'm making it my business now. He moved closer, his presence somehow both threatening and oddly comforting in a way I couldn't begin to understand. Come to Italy with me. 3 days. I'll ensure your mother's care is covered for the entire time you're gone, and I'll arrange for the facility to have a specialist consultation about her condition. The best neurologist in Miami owes me a favor. He'll see her this week. Why would you do that? Why would you offer me anything at all? You don't know me. I'm just a waitress who happened to hum a song your grandfather taught my grandmother 80 years ago. You're not just anything, Sophia. His voice dropped lower, more intense. You're the answer to a question I've been asking for 16 years. You're the missing piece of a story I've been guarding without understanding. And more than that, you're connected to the only pure thing my grandfather ever protected in his entire violent, complicated life. I wanted to say no. I wanted to walk out that door and never look back. Pretend this conversation had never happened. Go back to my small, safe, predictable life, where mafia bosses didn't show me photographs of my grandmother and offer to fly me to Italy to see trees that held 80-year-old love stories. But something in his eyes stopped me. Something that looked almost like desperation wrapped in careful control. Like he needed this as much as I suddenly realized I did. I can't just take 3 days off work, I said, hating how weak my protest sounded even to my own ears. Mr. Carletti will fire me if I don't show up for my shifts. And I need this job. I can't afford to lose this job. You won't lose anything. I'll speak to Carletti myself. You'll be paid for the time you're gone, with a bonus for the inconvenience. And when you come back, you'll have your position waiting for you exactly as it was before. He paused. Unless you choose not to come back at all. What does that mean? It means that after you see what I'm going to show you in Italy, after you understand the full scope of what your grandmother left behind, and what my grandfather wanted you to have, you might decide that working 60-hour weeks in a restaurant for tips isn't how you want to spend the rest of your life. His phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. But that's a conversation for later. Right now, I need an answer. Will you come to Italy with me or not? Everything in my sensible, careful, conflict-avoiding nature screamed at me to say no, to thank him politely for the information about my grandmother, to walk away from this man and his dangerous world and his impossible offers, to go back to being invisible, unimportant, safe in my smallness. But I heard my grandmother's voice in my head, singing that lullaby on Sunday mornings under the tree in her backyard. I saw her face in that photograph, young and radiant, and full of hope. I thought about 61 years of letters she'd never shown anyone, love she'd carried in secret until the day she died. I'll come, I heard myself say. But I need to understand something first. You said business that can't be delayed. What kind of business requires a mafia boss to fly to Italy on 24 hours' notice? His expression hardened. The kind of business that reminds me why my grandfather told your grandmother to run. The kind that proves Matteo was right when he said this world would consume her. He moved toward the door. My flight leaves tomorrow at 8 p.m. from Miami International. Private terminal. Gate 7. Be there by 7:30. Bring a passport and pack for 3 days. And Sophia? Yes? Don't tell anyone where you're going. Not your friends. Not your coworkers. Not anyone. For the next 3 days, you're under my protection, which means you're also under my rules. And rule number 1 is that no one knows you're with me. Understood? I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady if I tried to speak. He opened the door and paused, looking back at me one last time. There's something else you should know before tomorrow night. Something I haven't told you yet, because I wanted you to agree to come first. My stomach tightened. What is it? I'm engaged to be married. In 5 weeks. To a woman from a family that's allied with mine. An arrangement that was decided when we were children. A merger of territories and resources disguised as a wedding. His jaw tightened. I'm telling you this now because you deserve to know what you're walking into. My life isn't simple. It's not clean. And anyone who gets close to me gets pulled into complications they never asked for. The words hit me like cold water. Engaged. Getting married in 5 weeks. And he was asking me to fly to Italy with him tomorrow night to see a tree where our grandparents had carved their initials 80 years ago. Then why are you asking me to come at all? My voice came out smaller than I wanted. If you're getting married in 5 weeks, why does any of this matter? Why not just tell me the story and let me go? He was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on the doorknob, his back partially turned so I couldn't see his full expression. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something I couldn't quite identify. Because my grandfather spent 61 years regretting that he let your grandmother walk away without fighting for her. Because he died telling me to protect that tree, to honor that love, to remember that it was the only real thing in his entire life. He turned to face me fully. And because when I heard you humming that song tonight, I understood something I've never understood before. Some promises aren't meant to be kept, and some are the only things worth keeping, even if they destroy everything else. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt like a gunshot in the sudden silence. I stood alone in the break room of an empty restaurant, holding the memory of a photograph I'd only seen for 30 seconds, and tried to understand how my entire life had just changed direction without my permission. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. The neurologist will see your mother Friday at 2 p.m. Car service will pick you up tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pack comfortable shoes. The Grove isn't easy to reach. Else, I saved the number without letting myself think too hard about what I was doing. Then I picked up the napkins I'd been folding when this impossible night began, and tried to remember what my life had been like 45 minutes ago, before a mafia boss heard me humming a lullaby and decided I was the answer to a question he'd been asking for 16 years. But I couldn't remember. That life already felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone who didn't know that her grandmother had loved a man in Italy so deeply that she'd carried his song across an ocean and taught it to her granddaughter without ever explaining why. Someone who didn't know that love could survive 61 years of separation and still be strong enough to bring 2 strangers together in an empty restaurant on a Wednesday night in Miami. Someone who hadn't yet said yes to a man who was engaged to someone else, but looked at a tree in Naples like it held the only truth that mattered. I picked up my phone and texted back, "I'll be ready." The private terminal at Miami International looked nothing like the crowded chaos of regular departures. It was quiet, elegant, filled with leather chairs and soft lighting that made everything feel like a movie set, rather than a real place where real people made real decisions that would change their lives forever. I arrived at 7:15, 15 minutes early, because being late felt like admitting I was having second thoughts. My small carry-on bag contained 3 days' worth of clothes I'd packed and repacked 4 times, trying to decide what someone wears when visiting a tree that holds an 80-year-old love story with a mafia boss who's engaged to someone else. Luca was already there, standing near the windows that overlooked the tarmac, talking quietly on his phone in Italian. He wore dark jeans and a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking less like the man who'd sat at table 9 once a month, and more like someone who could command a room without saying a word. He ended his call when he saw me and crossed the space between us in 3 long strides. "You came. You sound surprised. I gave you 12 hours to change your mind. Most people would have used them." He took my bag before I could protest. The flight is 9 hours. We'll arrive in Naples tomorrow morning. Local time. I've arranged for us to go directly to the Grove before we do anything else. What about your business? The reason you had to fly out on such short notice? His expression hardened slightly. That will be handled later. The Grove comes first. A woman in a crisp uniform appeared beside us. Mr. Castellano, we're ready for departure whenever you are. He nodded, then gestured for me to follow him through a door that led directly onto the tarmac. The plane waiting there wasn't commercial, wasn't even close to commercial. It was sleek and white and looked like it cost more money than I would earn in 10 lifetimes of working 60-hour weeks. This is yours? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My family's. We have 3. This one is the smallest. He said it like it was nothing. Like owning 3 private jets was as normal as owning 3 coffee makers. After you. The interior was even more ridiculous than the exterior. Cream leather seats that looked more like recliners, a table with fresh flowers, windows that were twice the size of normal airplane windows. Everything smelled like expensive cologne and possibility. I chose a seat near the window and buckled myself in with shaking hands. Lucas sat across from me, close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his hands moved with careful precision when he poured water from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses. Nervous? He asked, handing me one of the glasses. Terrified, I admitted. I've never been on a plane before. Never left Florida, actually. Never had a reason to. Something shifted in his expression, softening. First time for everything. Then, the takeoff is the worst part. After that, it's just floating. The engine started with a low rumble that I felt in my chest. Within minutes, we were moving, accelerating, and then lifting into the air with a smoothness that surprised me. Miami dropped away below us. The city lights spreading out like a constellation made of human ambition and broken dreams. You can breathe now, Lucas said gently. We're up. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out slowly. How do you do this all the time? How do you just get on planes and fly across the world like it's nothing? Practice, necessity, and the knowledge that staying in one place too long makes you a target. He leaned back in his seat. Tell me about your mother. How bad is it? The question caught me off guard. Why do you want to know? Because you're sitting across from me on a plane to Italy instead of visiting her like you probably do 3 times a week. Because you work 60 hours a week to pay for her care. Because when I mentioned her yesterday, you looked like I'd reached into your chest and grabbed your heart. He paused. And because if we're going to spend 3 days together, I'd like to know more about you than the fact that you hum songs your grandmother taught you. I took a sip of water to buy myself time. She has vascular dementia. It started 5 years ago with small things. Forgetting where she parked, repeating questions, getting confused about dates. But it got worse fast. 2 years ago, I had to move her into assisted living because she kept leaving the stove on, kept wandering out of the house at night. Last year, she stopped recognizing me about half the time. That's why you work so much. To afford Clearview, it's the best facility I could find that I could almost afford. The staff is kind. They treat her like a person, not just a patient. Some places treat dementia patients like they're already gone, like they're just bodies taking up space. But Clearview remembers that she's still in there somewhere, even on the days when she doesn't remember herself. Luca was quiet for a moment. My grandfather, in those final months, he had moments of clarity between the morphine and the confusion. Sometimes he would look at me and I could see him, really him, trapped inside a body that was betraying him, and then the clarity would fade, and he'd be gone again, somewhere I couldn't reach him. He met my eyes. It's the cruelest thing I've ever watched. Someone disappearing slowly, piece by piece, while you stand there helpless. Yes, I whispered. Exactly that. People think death is the hard part, but the hard part is watching someone die by inches while they're still breathing. The hard part is visiting on Tuesday and she remembers your name, and visiting on Wednesday, and she thinks you're her sister who died 20 years ago. What does she remember about your grandmother? About Margaret? I smiled, despite the ache in my chest. She remembers the tree. She remembers sitting under it as a child, listening to Margaret sing that song. She remembers that Margaret would go out there every Sunday morning, no matter the weather, and sit under that tree for exactly 1 hour. My throat tightened. She doesn't remember my name most days, but she remembers that tree. She told me last month that it was the only place Margaret ever seemed truly at peace. Because she was sitting under a living connection to the man she loved. Luca's voice had gone soft. Because even though the tree was in Virginia and he was in Italy, they came from the same roots. She'd planted a piece of him in her backyard, and every Sunday she'd sit beneath it and pretend the distance didn't matter. The plane leveled out, reaching cruising altitude. The flight attendant appeared with a quiet offer of dinner, which Luca accepted with a nod. Within minutes, the table between us was set with food that looked like it belonged in Morelos rather than 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. "I can't eat," I said, staring at the perfectly arranged plates. "My stomach is in knots." "Try anyway. We won't land until 6 a.m. local time, and we're going straight to the Grove. You'll need your strength." He picked up his fork. "Besides, refusing to eat on my plane is like refusing hospitality. It's insulting." "Is that a real rule? Or are you making that up?" "Does it matter?" A slight smile played at his lips. "You're going to eat her way." So I ate. And he was right. I did need the food even though every bite felt like swallowing stones. We talked about small things while we ate. He told me about Naples, about the city and the coast and the way the volcano loomed over everything like a reminder that beauty and danger were often the same thing. I told him about growing up in Virginia, about the tree in my grandmother's backyard, about the way the leaves would turn silver in certain light. When the plates were cleared away, the flight attendant dimmed the cabin lights to near darkness. "We should sleep," Luca said. "It's going to be a long day tomorrow." "I don't think I can sleep. Too much adrenaline." I pulled a blanket over my legs. "You go ahead, though. I'll just look out the window." He didn't move. "You want to know about Sophia?" It wasn't a question. "Your fiancée?" "Yes. I want to know about her. She's 28. Daughter of the Marchetti family. One of the oldest organizations in Naples. Beautiful. Educated. Perfectly trained for the role she's expected to play." He said it all without emotion, like he was reading from a contract rather than describing the woman he was supposed to marry in 5 weeks. "We've known each other since we were children. The engagement was arranged when I was 17 and she was 15. Neither of us had a choice in the matter." "Do you love her?" "No." The answer was immediate, unequivocal. "I respect her. I even like her as a person. But I don't love her. I've never loved anyone in my life. The way my grandfather loved your grandmother." "But you're still going to marry her." "I was going to marry her. Before last night. Before I heard you humming that song. I was resigned to it. It was a duty. A merger. A strategic alliance that would benefit both families." He turned to look at me directly. "But now I've seen that photograph again. Really looked at it for the first time in years. And I keep thinking about my grandfather. About how he spent 61 years regretting that he didn't fight harder. How he died telling me to protect that tree because it was the only pure thing in his entire life." My heart was beating too fast. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't know anymore. I'm saying that for 16 years I've visited that tree and wondered what kind of love makes a man carve initials into bark and protect them for decades. And now I'm sitting across from the granddaughter of the woman who inspired that love, and I'm starting to understand things I was too young to understand when my grandfather died." He leaned forward. "I'm saying that bringing you to Italy might be the most selfish thing I've ever done, because I know that once you see that tree, once you stand where they stood, everything is going to change. For both of us." "How do you know it will change anything?" "Because some places hold memory in a way that rewrites present. Because that grove has been waiting for 81 years for someone to complete the story. Because you're Margaret's granddaughter and I'm Giovanni's grandson, and that means something. Whether we want it to or not." His voice dropped lower. "And because when I looked at you last night in that break room, when you told me about the tree in Virginia and the song she taught you, I felt something I've never felt before, like I'd been looking for you my entire life without knowing you existed." The words hung in the air between us, too big and too honest and too dangerous for the small space of a plain cabin somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. I wanted to say something back, to match his honesty with my own, but I couldn't find words that felt adequate for what was happening. "Sleep now," he said, sitting back. "Tomorrow you'll see why I've been protecting that tree for 16 years. And then you'll understand why some promises are worth breaking and others are the only things worth keeping." I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I listened to the engines humming, felt the plane carrying us across an ocean toward a tree that held an 80-year-old love story, and I thought about my grandmother, sitting under her tree every Sunday morning, singing a song to a man who was 3,000 miles away and loved her until his last breath. And I wondered if that kind of love was genetic, if it could skip generations and land on me, 27 years old and invisible, my entire life. Finally being seen by a man who was engaged to someone else but looked at me like I might be the answer to questions he didn't know how to ask. We landed in Naples at 6:30 in the morning, local time. The sun was just beginning to rise over the bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that looked almost impossible. Like someone had decided reality needed better lighting. Mount Vesuvius loomed in the distance, dark and ominous against the brightening horizon. A black car was waiting on the tarmac, engine already running. Luca guided me toward it with a hand on my lower back, a touch so brief and impersonal it might have meant nothing if I hadn't felt electricity shoot through my entire body from that single point of contact. The driver was a man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes who nodded at Luca but didn't speak. We climbed into the back seat, and within minutes we were leaving the airport behind, heading north through streets that were just beginning to wake up for the day. "How far is it?" I asked, watching Naples slide past the window. Old buildings pressed against new ones, centuries of history stacked on top of each other like layers of paint that had never been fully scraped away. 40 minutes if traffic cooperates. The land is outside the city, closer to the mountains. Luca's phone buzzed for what felt like the 100th time since we'd landed. He glanced at it, his jaw tightening, and then silenced it completely. They can wait. Who can wait? People who think their problems are more important than a promise I made to a dead man. 16 years ago, he looked out his own window. Business. Always business, never stops, never sleeps, never gives you a moment to remember that you're human and not just a function of the machine your family built. I wanted to ask what kind of business, wanted to understand what exactly a mafia boss did on a daily basis beyond terrifying restaurant staff and owning buildings and making people disappear. But the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands kept flexing like he was fighting the urge to answer his phone, told me this wasn't the moment for questions. We drove in silence for 20 minutes, leaving the city behind, climbing into hills covered in olive groves that stretched as far as I could see. Ancient trees, twisted and gnarled, their branches heavy with fruit that wasn't quite ready for harvest. Everything smelled like earth and salt air, and something indefinable that might have been history itself. The car turned onto a narrow dirt road that wound between stone walls older than America. We passed a crumbling farmhouse, an old chapel with a collapsed roof, terraces that had once held vineyards but now grew only wild grass and weeds. "Here," Luca said quietly. "Stop here." The driver pulled over near a rusted iron gate that hung open on broken hinges. Beyond it, I could see olive trees. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, spreading across a hillside that overlooked the bay far below. Luca got out and came around to open my door. "Leave your bag. We'll come back for it." I followed him through the gate and into the grove. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground beneath our feet. Birds sang somewhere in the canopy above us. The air was cool and sweet and tasted like salt from the distant ocean. We walked for maybe 5 minutes, weaving between trees, until Lucas stopped in front of one that was obviously older than all the others. Massive, ancient. Its trunk was so thick 3 people couldn't have wrapped their arms around it. The bark was deeply furrowed, twisted in ways that suggested centuries of growth and survival. "This is it," he said softly. "This is the tree." I stepped closer, my hand reaching out to touch the bark before I'd consciously decided to move, and there, carved so deep that 81 years of growth had failed to erase them, were the letters, M+G. Surrounded by a heart that had been traced and retraced so many times, the lines were twice as deep as they should have been. My fingers traced the men, feeling the rough bark, the grooves worn smooth by weather and time. They stood here, right here. She stood exactly where I'm standing. Yes. Luca's voice was rough, and he carved this while she watched. It took him an hour, using a knife he'd carried through the war. She told him it was foolish, that the tree would heal over and erase it within a few years. But he said it didn't matter. He said even if no one else ever saw it, even if the bark grew over it completely, he would know it was there, and that would be enough. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The weight of 81 years pressed down on me like physical force. My grandmother had stood in this exact spot, watching a man carve her initial into a tree, because he loved her too much to let her disappear without leaving evidence that she'd existed in his world. "There's something else," Luca said. He moved to the other side of the tree, gesturing for me to follow. "Look here." More carving. Fresher. Letters that had been cut into the bark within the last few decades rather than the last century. Words in Italian that I couldn't read. but the date beneath them was clear enough. March 15, 2009. What does it say? Some promises last forever. This one did. Luca's hand rested on the words. I carved it the day after his funeral. I didn't know who M was, didn't know the full story, but I knew he'd kept his promise. He'd protected this tree, protected their initials, protected the memory of 3 weeks in 1944 that changed his entire life. Tears were streaming down my face without permission. I tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming. Hot and relentless and inevitable. He really loved her. For 61 years, he really loved her. He really loved her. Luca turned to face me, fully. And now you understand why I had to bring you here. Why I've been protecting this place for 16 years without understanding why. Because this is proof that some loves don't die. They just wait, and wait, and wait for someone to remember them. His phone started buzzing again, vibrating in his pocket with an insistence that couldn't be ignored anymore. He pulled it out, his expression darkening as he read whatever was on the screen. Murda, he muttered. No, not now, not today. What is it? What's wrong? He typed something quickly, his thumbs moving with angry precision. My father. He's here. In Naples. He wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow. But apparently plans changed. He looked up at me. He knows I'm here. And he knows I'm not alone. My stomach dropped. How does he know that? Because my family doesn't do anything without surveillance? Because privacy is a luxury we gave up 3 generations ago. He shoved his phone back in his pocket. We need to go. Now. Before he decides to come here himself. Why would that be bad? I'm just someone you brought to see the tree. There's nothing wrong with that. Sophia, he grabbed my shoulders, his grip firm but not painful. My father is the head of our family. He's been planning my wedding to Sofia Marchetti for 11 years. This alliance is everything to him, the culmination of decades of negotiation and strategy. And if he sees you, if he figures out that you're not just a random tourist, if he realizes that you're Margaret Sullivan's granddaughter and that I brought you here specifically to see this tree. He stopped, his jaw working. He'll see you as a threat to the wedding, to the alliance, to everything he's built. I'm not a threat. I'm nobody. I'm just a waitress from Miami who wanted to see where her grandmother fell in love, 81 years ago. You stopped being nobody the moment I heard you humming that song. His hand slid from my shoulders to cup my face, tilting it up so I had to meet his eyes. You became everything. And that's the problem. Before I could respond, before I could process what he'd just said, his phone rang. Not a buzz, not a text, but an actual call that filled the quiet grove with jarring sound. He answered it, his voice cold and controlled. Father. Yes. I'm aware you landed early. Yes. I have business to attend to first. No, it can't wait. I'll meet you at the villa in 2 hours. A pause. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I could see Luca's expression hardening with every second that passed. That's not your concern, I said. 2 hours. I'll be there. Another pause. No. She's not. Fine. Yes. I understand. 2 hours. He ended the call and stood there for a moment, staring at the phone like it was a weapon someone had just used against him. We need to leave. Right now. He's sending men to confirm I'm not lying about my location. Lying about what? About being alone. About this being business. He took my hand and started pulling me back through the grove toward where we'd left the car. He knows something is off. He can always tell when I'm not telling him the full truth. And if his men see you with me, if they report back that I brought a woman to this grove, to this tree, he didn't finish the sentence. What happens if they report that? He cancels the wedding. He declares war on the Marchetti family for the insult. He makes an example of anyone he thinks was involved in undermining his plans. Luca's voice was tight, and he eliminates threats. Permanently, efficiently, without hesitation. The words were like ice water in my veins. You're saying he would kill me because I came to see a tree. I'm saying I won't let it get that far. We reached the car. The driver already had the engine running, like he'd sensed trouble before we'd even emerged from the grove. Luca opened the back door. Get in. Now. I got in. He slid in beside me and said something to the driver in rapid Italian. The car lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as we accelerated down the narrow road faster than seemed safe. Where are we going? Somewhere safe. Somewhere my father's men won't think to look. He was typing on his phone again, sending messages, making arrangements. I'm going to meet with my father, handle whatever crisis he thinks requires my immediate attention, and then I'm coming back for you. But you can't be anywhere near me when I do it. You can't be anywhere that connects you to me. This is insane. I should just go home. I should get on the next flight back to Miami and pretend this never happened. You can't. He looked at me and the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. Not anymore. Not now that they know you exist. Not now that you've seen the tree. Not now that I've brought you into this world. The only way to keep you safe is to keep you close. But hidden. Protected. Until I figure out how to fix this. Fix what? What exactly needs fixing? Everything. The word came out harsh. Desperate. My engagement. My father's expectations. The alliance with the Marchettis. The fact that I just realized, standing in that grove watching you cry over a carving from 1944, that I can't marry Sophia. I can't spend my life with someone I don't love while knowing that my grandfather spent 61 years regretting exactly that choice. The car swerved around a corner, and I grabbed the door handle to steady myself. So what are you going to do? I don't know yet. But I have 2 hours to figure it out before I face my father and explain why I flew to Naples. 12 hours early, why I went to that grove first thing in the morning, and why I'm about to do something that will probably start a war between families that have been allies for 30 years. He reached over and took my hand, threading his fingers through mine with a certainty that felt both comforting and terrifying. But whatever happens, whatever I decide, you need to understand something. Last night on the plane, I told you that bringing you here was selfish. I was right, because now that you're here, now that I've seen you touch that tree and cry for our grandparents' love, I can't imagine letting you go. And that makes you the most dangerous person in my life. Not because of who you are, but because of what you make me want to risk everything for. The words hung between us as the car raced through the hills, carrying us away from the grove and toward whatever came next. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that my life would never be the same, that the moment I'd touched those carved initials, the moment I'd stood where my grandmother had stood 81 years ago, I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. 2 hours, Luca said quietly, still holding my hand like it was the only solid thing in a world that had started to crumble. 2 hours to figure out how to choose between duty and desire, between the family that made me and the woman who makes me want to be someone different. And then the car turned onto a main road, and Naples appeared below us, sprawling and ancient and beautiful. And somewhere in that city, his father was waiting with questions that Luca didn't have safe answers for. The safe house was a small apartment in the old quarter of Naples, tucked above a bakery that smelled like bread and espresso and normalcy. Luca had left me there with a burner phone, strict instructions not to leave or contact anyone, and a promise that he'd be back before nightfall. That was 6 hours ago. I sat by the window watching the street below, watching people live their ordinary lives. A woman hanging laundry on a balcony across the way. 2 old men arguing over a chessboard at a cafe table, a child chasing pigeons, while his mother shouted warnings about staying close. Normal people with normal problems who had no idea that somewhere in this city, a man was choosing between duty and desire, and the wrong choice might get them both killed. The burner phone hadn't rung once. I kept touching it, checking that the battery hadn't died, that the volume was all the way up, that I hadn't somehow missed his call, but there was nothing, just silence that grew heavier with every passing minute. My mind kept going back to the tree, to the way the bark felt under my fingers, rough and warm and alive despite being carved 81 years ago, to the way Luca had looked at me when I'd started crying, like he was seeing something he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it existed, to the way he'd said I was the most dangerous person in his life, not because I was actually dangerous, but because I made him want things that would destroy everything he'd been raised to protect, his family's alliance, his father's plans. The wedding that was supposed to happen in less than 5 weeks to a woman he respected but didn't love. I thought about my grandmother, about Margaret standing in that same grove, watching Giovanni carve her initial into a tree, because he couldn't let her disappear without leaving proof that she'd mattered to him, and then she'd left anyway. She'd walked away, gotten on a ship back to America, and spent the next 61 years carrying his song across an ocean while he stayed in Italy and married someone else, because that's what duty demanded. And I'd spent my entire life believing that was romantic, that their sacrifice somehow made their love more pure, more noble, more worthy of the tears my grandmother cried every Sunday morning under that tree in Virginia. But sitting in this apartment, waiting for a man who might not come back, I finally understood what my grandmother had actually felt. Not romance, not nobility, just regret so deep it had lasted 6 decades and survived death itself. She hadn't wanted to leave. She'd left because she thought she had to, because someone told her that loving him would consume her, would pull her into a world she couldn't morally accept, would make her complicit in things that would destroy who she was. And maybe that person was right. Maybe Margaret would have been consumed. Maybe she would have lost herself trying to exist in Giovanni's world. But she'd lost herself anyway, just slowly, over 61 years instead of all at once. I stood up from the window, pacing the small apartment like a caged animal. 3 steps to the kitchen, 4 steps to the bathroom, 2 steps to the bedroom door. I hadn't opened because I was afraid if I lay down, I'd fall apart completely. This was it. This was the moment where I had to decide who I was going to be. I could be like my grandmother. I could wait for Luca to come back, listen to whatever decision he'd made about his wedding, his father, his duty. I could nod and accept it and get on a plane back to Miami. I could go back to my 60-hour weeks and my invisible life and pretend that standing under that tree hadn't changed everything. I could be good, safe, conflict-avoiding, invisible, or I could be someone different. The thought hit me like cold water. Someone different. Not the Sophia who'd spent 27 years making herself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. Not the Sophia who hummed songs while folding napkins and accepted that her life was what it was and nothing more. Someone who fought. Someone who chose. Someone who refused to spend the next 60 years sitting under a metaphorical tree, regretting the moment she let fear make her decisions. I picked up the burner phone and stared at it. Luca had told me not to call him, had said it was too dangerous, that his father might be monitoring his communications, that any contact could expose me. But sitting here waiting for him to decide my fate wasn't fighting. It was surrendering before the battle had even started. I dialed the only number programmed into the phone. It rang twice before he answered. Sophia. His voice was tight, strained. I told you not to call unless it was an emergency. It is an emergency. My hands were shaking, but my voice came out steady. I need to tell you something before you make whatever decision you're making with your father. This isn't the time. I'm in the middle of... I don't care. The words came out harder than I'd intended. I don't care what you're in the middle of. I don't care if your father is sitting right there listening. I need to say this now before I lose my nerve and go back to being the person who never says anything that might cause conflict. Silence on the other end. Then I'm listening. My grandmother spent 61 years regretting that she left your grandfather. She spent 61 years singing a song to a man she'd loved for 3 weeks in 1944. She died without ever seeing him again, without ever knowing if he thought about her as much as she thought about him, without ever finding out if walking away was the brave choice or the coward's choice. I was pacing again, words spilling out faster than I could organize them, and I spent my entire life thinking that was beautiful, that their sacrifice somehow made their love more real, more meaningful, more worthy of remembering. Sophia. I'm not finished. I stopped pacing, pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, but it wasn't beautiful, it was wasteful. It was 2 people choosing duty over desire and spending the rest of their lives regretting it. It was my grandmother teaching me that song every night because it was the only piece of him she had left. It was your grandfather protecting that tree for decades because it was the only proof that she'd existed in his world for 3 weeks before disappearing forever. I could hear his breathing on the other end. Slow. Controlled, waiting. So here's what I need to tell you, before you decide anything. I didn't fly 3,000 miles to see a tree. I flew 3,000 miles, because for the first time in my entire invisible life, someone saw me, really saw me. And that someone was you. My voice cracked, but I pushed through. And if you choose duty over this, if you choose your father's plans and your arranged marriage and keeping the peace, I'll understand. I'll get on a plane and go back to Miami. And I won't blame you for it. But I won't forget you. Just like your grandfather never forgot my grandmother. Just like she never forgot him. I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if you'd chosen differently. And that's not romance, Luca. That's just slow-motion heartbreak that lasts for decades. The silence stretched so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then, where are you right now? The safe house. The apartment above the bakery, where you left me 6 hours ago. Stay there. Don't move. Don't open the door for anyone except me. His voice had changed. Harder, more decisive. I'm coming to get you. And when I get there, we're finishing this conversation in person. What about your father? What about the meeting? The meeting is over. I made my choice. A pause. I chose you, Sophia. I chose us. And now I have to deal with the consequences of that choice. But I'd rather deal with consequences than spend the next 60 years regretting the moment I was too afraid to fight for something real. The line went dead. I stood there holding the burner phone, my heart racing, my entire body shaking with adrenaline and terror and something that might have been hope. He'd chosen. He'd actually chosen. Not duty, not family, not the wedding that would keep the peace between allied organizations. He'd chosen me. And somewhere in Naples, that choice was probably starting a war. Luca arrived 40 minutes later. I heard his footsteps on the stairs before his knock, 3 sharp raps that somehow communicated urgency and control in equal measure. I opened the door and he was there, still in the same clothes from this morning, but different somehow. His shirt was wrinkled, his jaw tight, and there was a cut above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there when he'd left me at the safe house 6 hours ago. What happened to your face? I reached up instinctively to touch the cut, but he caught my wrist gently before my fingers made contact. My father's ring. He has a tendency to emphasize important points with his fists when words aren't sufficient. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, locking it with quick, efficient movements. But I'm fine. It's not the first time. Won't be the last. He hit you because you told him about me. He hit me because I told him the wedding is canceled, that I won't marry Sophia Marchetti, that I don't care what alliances it destroys or what wars it starts. Luca moved to the window, checking the street below with the automatic caution of someone who'd spent his entire life watching for threats. Telling him about you came after that. Once I'd already burned the bridge, I figured I might as well explain why. My heart was beating too fast. What did he say when you told him about me? He said I was throwing away 30 years of careful planning for a woman I'd known for less than 48 hours. He said I was choosing passion over reason, desire over duty, selfishness over family. Luca turned to face me. He said I was making the same mistake my grandfather made in 1944, except this time I was stupid enough to actually act on it. And what did you say? I said he was right, that I was making the exact same mistake, except it's not a mistake if you learn from history instead of repeating it blindly. He crossed the small apartment in 3 strides and stood in front of me, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. My grandfather let your grandmother walk away because people told him it was the right thing to do, because duty mattered more than happiness, because love wasn't enough to justify disrupting carefully laid plans. He cupped my face with both hands, his touch gentle despite the violence still visible in the cut above his eyebrow. But I've spent 16 years visiting that tree, Sophia. 16 years standing under carved initials and wondering what kind of love survives 61 years of separation. And now, I know. It's the kind that never had a chance to become anything more than a memory. It's the kind that died of starvation while everyone around it insisted that sacrifice was noble. So what happens now? My voice came out barely above a whisper. Your father knows about me. The Marchetti family knows the wedding is canceled. What happens when they decide I'm the reason their alliance fell apart? They can't touch you. His thumbs traced my cheekbones with devastating gentleness. I've already made it clear that any threat to you is a threat to me personally, and threatening me personally means war with the entire Castellano organization. My father might hate my decision, but he's not going to let another family harm his son over it, even if he thinks I'm the reason you made that decision. Especially because you're the reason I made that decision. Because that means you matter to me enough that losing you would break me in ways that enemies could exploit. He leaned his forehead against mine. You're not a weakness, Sophia. You're the first thing in my entire life that I've chosen for myself, instead of accepting what was chosen for me before I was old enough to have an opinion. Your grandfather never got to choose. He had to watch my grandmother leave, and spend the rest of his life wondering what if. I know, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to spend the next 60 years protecting a carving and pretending that's enough. His hand slid from my face to my shoulders, then down to take both of my hands in his. But I need you to understand what you're signing up for. My life isn't normal. It's not safe. There will be consequences for this choice. Complications that we can't predict yet. The Marchetti family isn't going to just accept the broken engagement without demanding some kind of compensation or revenge. I know that. I've known that since the moment you told me who you really are in that break room at Morello's. I squeezed his hands. But I'd rather face complications with you than spend my life avoiding them alone. I'd rather fight than regret. I'd rather choose and fail than never choose at all. Something in his expression shifted, softened, like I'd said exactly what he needed to hear. Then we do this together. No more hiding, no more safe houses and burner phones. We face whatever comes next as a unit. Together, I repeated. But I need to ask you something first. What about Sophia? Does she know yet? Does she understand why the wedding is canceled? A slight smile played at his lips. Sophia knows. I called her before I came here, and her response was, and I quote, "Thank God, I was dreading having to pretend to be in love with you for the next 40 years. He paused. Turns out she's been in a relationship with her bodyguard for 3 years. A woman named Elena. The wedding was as much a prison for her as it was for me. Relief flooded through me so suddenly. I felt lightheaded. So she's not heartbroken. She's not going to come after me with a knife for stealing her fiancé. She's not coming after you with anything. She's too busy celebrating her freedom." Luca pulled me closer, eliminating the last inch of space between us. "Although she did say she wants to meet you, she said anyone brave enough to make me cancel a wedding after 30 years of planning must be extraordinary." "I'm not extraordinary. I'm just tired of being invisible." "You were never invisible, Sophia. You were just waiting for someone to actually look." His voice dropped lower, rougher. "And I'm looking now. I'm seeing you, and I'm choosing you over everything else that used to matter before I heard you humming a song in a break room and realized my entire life had been leading to that exact moment." He kissed me then, finally, after 2 days of tension and proximity and carefully maintained distance. And it wasn't gentle, wasn't tentative, wasn't the kind of first kiss that tests boundaries before committing. It was certain and deep, and tasted like a promise that both of us were terrified to make but couldn't stop ourselves from wanting. When we pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine again. "We should leave Naples. Tonight. My father needs time to accept what I've done, and the Marchettis need time to figure out how to respond without escalating to violence. We'll go somewhere neutral, somewhere neither family has strong presence." "Where?" "Back to Miami. Where this started. Where I first heard you sing my grandfather's song and everything changed." He kissed my forehead, gentle this time, reverent, "and then we figure out how to build something new. Not what our grandparents had, not 61 years of letters and longing, but something real that we create together. Starting a war with your own family and building a relationship at the same time, that's not exactly a simple plan. Nothing about us is simple, Sophia, but simple is boring. And I've spent 30 years being exactly what everyone expected me to be." He smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, it reached his eyes completely. "I think it's time I tried being something else, someone who fights for what he wants, instead of accepting what he's told to want. Someone who chooses love over duty. Someone who realizes that choosing love is the only duty that actually matters in the end." He took my hand and pulled me toward the door. "Come on. We have a plane to catch, and a life to start living before anyone changes their mind and decides we made a terrible mistake." We landed in Miami, 36 hours later. The city looked exactly the same as when we'd left, but everything felt different, like we'd crossed an invisible line somewhere over the Atlantic and couldn't go back to who we'd been before, even if we wanted to. Luca's phone had been buzzing constantly since we boarded the plane in Naples. Messages from his father, from family associates, from the Marchettis demanding explanations and compensation for the broken alliance. He'd ignored all of them, keeping his attention on me instead, his hand never leaving mine for the entire 9-hour flight. "What happens now?" I asked, as we collected our bags from the private terminal. "Do we just pretend everything is normal? Do I go back to Morello's and fold napkins like none of this ever happened?" "You're not going back to Morello's." He loaded our bags into the waiting car. "You're not going back to 60-hour weeks and invisibility and pretending you're nobody. You're coming with me." "Where?" "Everywhere." He opened the car door for me. "Starting with Clearview. I made arrangements while you were sleeping on the plane. Your mother is being transferred to a private facility with full-time specialized care. The best neurologist in the country is flying in next week to consult on her case, and her bills are paid in full for the next 5 years. Minimum." Tears burned behind my eyes. "Luca, I can't let you do that. That's too much. I can't accept." "You're not accepting charity, Sophia. You're accepting help from someone who loves you." He said it simply, matter-of-factly, like it wasn't the most significant thing anyone had ever said to me in my entire life. "And yes, I love you. I've loved you since I heard you humming that song. Maybe I've loved you longer than that, Maybe I've been waiting for you my entire life without knowing it. But either way, what's mine is yours. Now, including the resources to take care of the people you love. The car pulled away from the airport, heading toward the city that had always felt too big and too small at the same time. But sitting next to Luca, his hand warm in mine, his words still echoing in my head. Miami felt different, like it had expanded to hold possibilities I'd never let myself imagine before. So we're really doing this, I said quietly. We're really choosing each other despite the complications and the consequences and the wars we might have started. We're really doing this. He lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to my knuckles. Our grandparents got 3 weeks in a grove in Naples. We're taking the rest of our lives, and I don't care how many families I have to negotiate with, how many alliances I have to rebuild, or how many years it takes to make everyone accept that I chose love over duty. It'll be worth it. You're worth it. I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching Miami slide past the window, and thought about my grandmother sitting under that tree every Sunday morning, singing a song to a man she'd loved and lost, carrying regret for 61 years like a weight she couldn't put down. But I wasn't going to carry that weight. I wasn't going to spend my life wondering what if. Because I'd stood under that tree in Naples, touched those carved initials, and learned the most important lesson 2 people could learn from history. That some loves are worth fighting for, that duty without desire is just a slow death, and that choosing each other, really choosing with full knowledge of the cost, is the only way to honor the people who came before us and never got that chance. My phone buzzed with a text, an unknown number. I opened it, and my breath caught a photograph, black and white, slightly faded. The same one Luca had shown me in the break room at Morello's. Margaret and Giovanni under the olive tree, young and in love and about to be separated by duty and distance, and 61 years of regret. Below it, a message: they would have wanted you to have this. They would have wanted you to choose differently. Elsie. I looked up at Luca. You sent me the photograph. I had it scanned before we left Italy, so you'd always have proof that their love was real, even if they never got to build a life from it. He squeezed my hand. We're building that life for them. The one they should have had. The one they deserved but were too afraid or too dutiful or too controlled by other people's expectations to claim. The car turned onto the street where Clearview stood waiting, where my mother would be transferred to better care, where the weight of financial desperation would finally lift from my shoulders, where one chapter ended and another began. Thank you, I whispered. Not just for the photograph, not just for my mother's care, but for everything. For seeing me, for choosing me, for being brave enough to break promises that should never have been made in the first place. Don't thank me yet. He smiled. That devastating smile that still made my heart race. Wait until you meet the rest of my family and see what you've really gotten yourself into. Wait until you understand that being with me means living in a world that's beautiful and dangerous and complicated in equal measure. I'm ready for that world. And I meant it. Because I'd spent 27 years being invisible, being safe, being nothing to anyone, and I'd rather be something dangerous and complicated and real than nothing safe and forgettable. Good, he kissed me then, gentle and certain. Because this is just the beginning.